Long before the days of Jonah and the rise of Nineveh, the world was a patchwork of early civilizations striving to make sense of the divine. Mesopotamia, often referred to as the cradle of civilization, was home to great cities like Babylon, Assur, and eventually Nineveh. Situated along the Tigris River, Nineveh would become a sprawling metropolis, known not only for its architectural grandeur but also for its infamous cruelty and decadence. But before it reached such heights, the seeds of its destiny were planted in the broader culture of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were a fierce and industrious people. Their society was built on military conquest, trade, and an intricate system of gods and rituals. At the heart of their belief system was Ashur, the chief deity, whose name also inspired their capital city. Ashur represented war, prosperity, and divine order, a figure who demanded loyalty and obedience, much like the kings who ruled in his name. To please Ashur, the Assyrians often engaged in brutal practices, including the subjugation of neighboring peoples and the public display of their victories. Inscriptions found on stone tablets boast of their conquests, describing rivers of blood and walls adorned with the skulls of their enemies. Despite these grim practices, Assyrian culture also thrived in areas like astronomy, medicine, and art. Libraries in cities like Nineveh housed clay tablets inscribed with ancient texts, showcasing their advanced understanding of mathematics and literature. The city itself, under rulers like King Sennacherib, was a marvel of engineering, featuring vast palaces, aqueducts, and a famous wall that stretched over 7 miles. The term Nineveh itself is believed to have derived from the Akkadian word Ninua, possibly linked to the goddess Ishtar, associated with love, war, and fertility. This duality of destruction and creation symbolized the city's essence, a place of both flourishing culture and moral depravity. The moral landscape before Jonah's time. Before Jonah's arrival, Nineveh had already earned its reputation as a place of excess and corruption. Historical records suggest the city was a melting pot of peoples, languages, and customs, drawn together by trade routes and the Assyrian Empire's expanding reach. Merchants from distant lands brought goods, stories, and beliefs, creating a cosmopolitan environment that masked an undercurrent of moral decay. The Assyrians believed deeply in their gods, yet their faith was transactional. They offered sacrifices and tributes not out of love, but to ensure favor in war, bountiful harvests, or protection from disease. This contrasts sharply with the God of Israel, Yahweh, whose character is described as Rekem Vekanan, merciful and gracious, in Hebrew. These attributes, central to God's identity, stand in stark contrast to the harsh, demanding nature of the gods worshipped in Nineveh. A universal God in a divided world. During this time, the Hebrew people lived under a covenantal relationship with Yahweh. This was a revolutionary concept, a God who not only demanded moral and spiritual allegiance but also offered grace and forgiveness. This God was unique in his desire for justice tempered with mercy, a stark contrast to the deities of Mesopotamia. Yahweh's compassion extended beyond Israel, a theme that would later be embodied in Jonah's mission to Nineveh. Yet, the people of Israel, like Jonah himself, often struggled with this universal vision. To them, the Assyrians were enemies, symbols of oppression and violence. How could a God of justice and righteousness extend compassion to such a people? This tension forms the crux of Jonah's story and God's ultimate lesson to his reluctant prophet. Setting the stage. As Nineveh's walls grew higher and its streets more crowded, so did its sins. Idolatry, violence, and arrogance defined its legacy, echoing the warnings of the prophets who spoke against such practices. But amidst the city's turmoil, there remained a divine plan, one that would unfold in a most unexpected way. The story of Jonah and Nineveh is not merely about a prophet and a city, it is about the boundless nature of God's grace and his willingness to redeem even the most wayward of peoples. And so, we return to a single figure, a man named Jonah. His name, meaning dove in Hebrew, carries an irony that permeates his story. A dove, often a symbol of peace, is called to deliver a message of impending judgment. But Jonah's own journey reveals a far greater purpose: to show that God's compassion knows no borders, no prejudices, and no limits. Here begins a story of reluctance, redemption, and divine compassion, a story as relevant today as it was in the days of Nineveh. The stage is set, and the lessons of the past are ready to unfold. In the bustling northern kingdom of Israel, a prophet named Jonah lived during the reign of Jeroboam II. This period, roughly in the 8th century BCE, was marked by relative prosperity for Israel but also deep moral and spiritual decline. Prophets like Jonah served as God's messengers, often calling the people back to covenantal faithfulness. Yet Jonah's story would diverge sharply from the typical prophetic mission. One day, Jonah received an extraordinary command from Yahweh. "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." Jonah 1 verse 2. This was unprecedented. Prophets typically spoke to Israel, occasionally delivering messages about surrounding nations. But Jonah's task was different. He was to travel to Nineveh itself, the heart of the Assyrian Empire, and confront its people directly. The implications of this mission were staggering. Nineveh, known for its brutality and idolatry, was Israel's sworn enemy. To Jonah, it was unthinkable that such a place deserved God's warning, let alone his compassion. The Hebrew meaning of the call. The Hebrew word used for cry against is kara, which can also mean proclaim. This dual meaning reveals a tension in Jonah's mission. It is both a call to judgment and an opportunity for repentance. Yahweh's intent is not annihilation but transformation, a point Jonah deeply resists. Jonah flees. Instead of obeying, Jonah fled. He went down to Joppa, a port city, and boarded a ship bound for Tarshish, a distant and largely unknown location in the western Mediterranean. Scholars debate the exact location of Tarshish, but it symbolized a place as far from Nineveh, and God's call, as Jonah could imagine. Jonah's decision was not merely an act of fear but outright rebellion. He knew God's character too well. As he later admits, "I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." Jonah 4 verse 2. Jonah's refusal was rooted in his unwillingness to see Nineveh spared. He wanted justice, not mercy. The journey to Tarshish. On board the ship, Jonah's rebellion sets the stage for divine intervention. A great storm arose, threatening to destroy the vessel. The sailors, pagans who worshipped a pantheon of gods, cried out in desperation and cast lots to determine the cause of their misfortune. The lot fell on Jonah. When confronted, Jonah confessed, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Jonah 1 verse 9. His admission startled the sailors, who realized the storm was no mere coincidence but the work of a God far greater than their own. The sacrifice of Jonah. Jonah instructed the sailors to throw him overboard, believing his death would calm the storm. Reluctantly, they complied, and as soon as Jonah hit the water, the sea grew calm. The sailors, awestruck, offered sacrifices and vows to Yahweh, a striking moment of pagan conversion in the midst of Jonah's defiance. But Jonah's story did not end in the depths. As he sank, a great fish, appointed by God, swallowed him whole. In this extraordinary act, Jonah was both punished and preserved, trapped in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, a period that would later hold profound symbolic meaning in biblical theology. In the silence and darkness of the fish's belly, Jonah is forced to confront his disobedience and the nature of God's mercy. His journey outward to Nineveh will now mirror an internal transformation, one that begins with prayer and a renewed understanding of the mission he cannot escape. Inside the belly of the great fish, Jonah was brought to the lowest point of his journey, both physically and spiritually. The text describes this as a moment of profound reckoning. Enveloped by darkness and surrounded by the chaos of the deep, Jonah cried out to Yahweh in a desperate prayer, recorded in poetic form in Jonah 2 verses 2-9. Jonah's prayer, a turning point. Jonah's prayer reveals his inner transformation. He acknowledges God's sovereignty over creation and salvation. I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Jonah 2 verse 2. The term Sheol here refers to the Hebrew concept of the grave or the realm of the dead. Jonah likens his situation to being in Sheol, emphasizing his utter helplessness and dependence on God. This prayer is not merely a plea for rescue but a declaration of faith in God's mercy. Despite Jonah's disobedience, he recognizes that only Yahweh can save him. The climax of his prayer comes with a vow. But I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving, I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord, Jonah 2 verse 9. This statement marks a turning point. Jonah acknowledges that salvation belongs to Yahweh alone, whether for himself, for Israel, or even for Nineveh. God's response. In response to Jonah's prayer, the Lord commands the fish to vomit Jonah onto dry land. This act is both symbolic and practical. Jonah is given a second chance, a moment of divine grace that mirrors the very message he is called to deliver to Nineveh. The location of Jonah's emergence is not specified, but he now stands at a crossroads, faced again with the command to go to Nineveh. Arrival in Nineveh. When Jonah finally reaches Nineveh, he is confronted with the overwhelming scale of the task before him. The city is described as an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth, Jonah 3 verse 3. This phrase likely refers to the city's size and importance. Archaeological evidence suggests that Nineveh, under rulers like Sennacherib, was one of the largest cities of its time, with massive walls, grand palaces, and bustling markets. The Assyrians, known for their opulence and military might, lived in stark contrast to Jonah's simpler, covenant-bound existence as an Israelite. Their culture was steeped in rituals to appease their gods, practices Jonah would have viewed as abominations. Yet, here he was, tasked with delivering a message from Yahweh, the God of Israel, to this foreign and seemingly irredeemable people. Jonah's proclamation. Jonah's message to Nineveh was startling in its simplicity and directness. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Jonah 3 verse 4. The Hebrew word for overthrown is hafak, which can mean both destroyed and transformed. This double meaning reflects the dual possibility inherent in God's warning: destruction if they persist in sin, or transformation through repentance. A shocking response. To Jonah's astonishment, the people of Nineveh responded immediately. From the greatest to the least, they believed God and proclaimed a fast. Even the king of Nineveh arose from his throne, removed his royal robes, and sat in ashes, a traditional sign of mourning and repentance in ancient Near Eastern cultures. He issued a decree that everyone, including animals, should fast and cry out to God. The Assyrians, a people known for their pride and brutality, humbled themselves in a way that Jonah could never have anticipated. Their repentance was genuine, and it carried a collective weight rarely seen in biblical narratives. As Nineveh turns from its wicked ways, the question lingers: how will Jonah, and even Yahweh, respond to this dramatic act of repentance? Jonah's journey outward is complete, but his internal struggle with God's mercy is far from resolved. The repentance of Nineveh was nothing short of miraculous. A city renowned for its violence and idolatry had collectively turned to God in humility and contrition. However, while the people rejoiced in the possibility of divine forgiveness, Jonah's reaction was starkly different. Instead of sharing in their newfound hope, Jonah was consumed by anger and frustration. Jonah's anger at God's compassion. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry, Jonah 4 verse 1. The Hebrew word for angry here is chara, which conveys a deep, burning rage. Jonah's emotions reveal his underlying struggle with God's character. In his prayer, Jonah exclaims, "Is this not what I said while I was still in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm, Jonah 4 verse 2. Jonah's frustration lies in the very nature of God's mercy. To him, Nineveh's repentance was not a triumph but a failure of justice. He had hoped for the city's destruction, not its redemption. His perspective reflects a narrow, human understanding of divine justice, one that prioritizes punishment over grace. Jonah's self-centered view. Jonah retreats from the city and sets up a shelter to the east, waiting to see what will happen. This action underscores Jonah's stubbornness. Despite Nineveh's repentance and God's clear response, Jonah clings to the hope that destruction might still come. His self-imposed exile mirrors his internal isolation. He has separated himself from God's mission, preferring to sulk rather than celebrate. The lesson of the plant. In an effort to teach Jonah about compassion, God causes a plant to grow over Jonah's shelter, providing him shade and comfort. Jonah is delighted by the plant, but his joy is short-lived. The next day, God appoints a worm to attack the plant, causing it to wither. As the sun rises, a scorching east wind beats down on Jonah, leaving him faint and angry once more. God confronts Jonah with a pointed question. Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Jonah 4 verse 9. Jonah, unyielding, replies that his anger is justified. In this moment, God draws a parallel between Jonah's attachment to the plant and his own compassion for Nineveh. You have had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and also much livestock? Jonah 4 verses 10 to 11. A divine perspective. Through this analogy, God exposes Jonah's hypocrisy. Jonah cared deeply for a plant that provided him comfort but had no concern for an entire city of people created in God's image. The mention of 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left likely refers to children or those lacking moral understanding, emphasizing Nineveh's vulnerability and innocence. Even the livestock are noted, highlighting the breadth of God's mercy. Jonah's story ends abruptly, leaving the reader to reflect on God's question. The unresolved tension invites introspection. Do we share God's compassion for others, or do we cling to our own notions of who deserves grace? This open-ended conclusion challenges us to consider how we align with the heart of a merciful and just God. The story of Jonah concludes with God's profound question, but its implications stretch far beyond the prophet and Nineveh. To fully grasp the weight of this narrative, it is essential to view it through a broader lens, one that encompasses not just Israel and Nineveh, but the nature of God's plan for humanity and his call for compassion in all times. Nineveh as a symbol of redemption. Nineveh, as a historical city, represented everything opposed to Israel: violence, idolatry, and a seemingly unrepentant heart. Yet, in this story, Nineveh becomes a symbol of divine redemption. Its transformation serves as a powerful reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's mercy. The city's repentance also showcases the power of humility. The king of Nineveh set aside his royal robes, descending into the dust alongside his people. This act of solidarity reflects a deep understanding of collective responsibility, a lesson that resonates in modern societies, where repentance and change often require unity and humility on a communal level. Jonah as a reflection of human nature. Jonah, in contrast, embodies the struggles of the human heart. His reluctance, anger, and isolation mirror the common tendency to resist God's will when it conflicts with personal biases or desires. Jonah's story is not just about his failure but also about God's persistent effort to teach him, and by extension, us, about the nature of divine love. The plant, worm, and scorching wind illustrate God's meticulous teaching methods. These elements symbolize the fleeting nature of earthly comforts and the importance of aligning one's perspective with God's eternal purposes. Jonah's attachment to the plant reveals his misplaced priorities, prioritizing personal comfort over the salvation of an entire city. The heart of God. At the core of this narrative is God's unchanging character. The Hebrew word chesed, often translated as steadfast love or loving kindness, encapsulates the depth of God's compassion. Throughout the Bible, this attribute is central to God's dealings with humanity, whether in his covenant with Israel or his extension of grace to Gentile nations like Nineveh. God's rhetorical question to Jonah, "Should I not pity Nineveh?" underscores his universal care. The mention of 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left emphasizes God's awareness of every individual, including the innocent and vulnerable. This divine perspective challenges human notions of justice, urging us to embrace a broader, more inclusive view of God's love. The challenge to the reader. Jonah's story ends without a response from the prophet, leaving the narrative open-ended. This deliberate choice compels readers to grapple with the same question God posed to Jonah. Will we align ourselves with God's compassion, or will we cling to our prejudices and desire for retribution? This story is as relevant today as it was in Jonah's time. In a world divided by conflict, cultural differences, and moral decay, the message of Nineveh challenges us to extend grace even to those we might deem undeserving. It calls us to examine our hearts and live as agents of God's compassion. For modern believers, the story of Jonah is a reminder of the Church's mission to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 20, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us." Like Jonah, we are called to carry the message of repentance and redemption, not with reluctance, but with a heart that mirrors God's steadfast love. The story of Jonah often draws focus to the external events, the storm, the fish, Nineveh's repentance, but its most profound lessons lie within the silent struggle of the human soul against the overwhelming scale of divine mercy. When viewed from this angle, the narrative transcends its immediate context and reveals a cosmic battle between human limitations and God's boundless grace. The inner turmoil of Jonah. Jonah's rebellion against God's call is not just an act of defiance but a window into the human condition. His reluctance stems from an intrinsic fear of losing control over justice, identity, and the boundaries of divine love. Jonah represents humanity's tendency to resist what it cannot understand. Why would God care for Nineveh, a city of sworn enemies? Why would a righteous God show compassion to the unrighteous? Jonah's struggle is not simply with God's command but with the implications of that command. If Nineveh can be forgiven, then Jonah must confront a terrifying reality: God's mercy cannot be contained or owned by any one people. This shatters the prophet's sense of identity as a member of the chosen nation and forces him to wrestle with the universal nature of God's plan. Nineveh as a mirror. Nineveh, often seen as the antagonist, is more accurately a reflection of humanity's own need for redemption. The city's rapid repentance is almost shocking in its sincerity. How could a people so steeped in violence and idolatry turn so quickly? This swift transformation serves as a mirror, reflecting the potential for grace in even the most hardened hearts. Nineveh's story invites readers to consider their own hidden sins, their own need for a moment of humbling before God. The stark contrast between Jonah's stubbornness and Nineveh's repentance flips the expected narrative. The prophet, a representative of God's will, resists change, while the supposed enemies embrace it. This inversion challenges readers to rethink their assumptions about who is truly close to God and who is far. A cosmic vision of mercy. The story of Jonah is ultimately about more than Nineveh or Israel. It is about the scale of God's mercy across the cosmos. God's compassion is not limited by geography, ethnicity, or morality. His care extends not only to 120,000 people in Nineveh but also to their livestock, an often overlooked detail. This inclusion of animals points to the comprehensive nature of divine love, one that embraces all of creation. Jonah's reluctance, in contrast, highlights humanity's finite perspective. To Jonah, Nineveh's sins were too great to forgive; to God, they were another opportunity to demonstrate his redemptive power. This cosmic scale of mercy challenges us to expand our understanding of God's plans and purposes. It reminds us that His ways are not our ways, nor His thoughts our thoughts. Isaiah 55 verses 8-9. The unfinished story. The abrupt ending of Jonah's story leaves the ultimate resolution to the reader. It is a masterful narrative choice, forcing each person to decide where they stand in this cosmic tension. Are we, like Jonah, unwilling to see beyond our limited vision of justice? Or can we embrace the overwhelming truth of God's mercy, even when it challenges our deepest assumptions? In this way, Jonah's journey becomes a mirror for all who read it. The story compels us to ask difficult questions. How do we respond to the unexpected grace of God? Can we truly rejoice when mercy is extended to those we deem unworthy? And are we willing to trust a God whose love knows no bounds? Jonah's silent struggle and the cosmic scale of God's mercy leave an indelible mark on the reader. It is a story not just of a prophet and a city but of every individual's journey toward understanding and embracing the heart of God. The challenge is timeless, the lesson profound: to see with divine eyes, to love with divine grace, and to recognize that no soul is beyond redemption.